Well, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the English explorers. The first thing you understand about the English, the first thing you need to write down is the English were late. They were tardy. The English were about 100 years behind Spain and Portugal, and in many ways even behind France. Now, sure, they had an explorer out there really quick after Columbus, but they didn't really do anything with what they actually founded. So it's a miracle in the first place that these English colonies, which were a part of the Reformational vision in many ways, it's a miracle that they actually got off the ground or actually succeeded, and that English is what you're hearing this in right now. It's quite possible we could be speaking a different language if the English had failed, which is quite honestly, when you look at history, what you would expect based upon how late they came into the game. But the first person we're going to take a look at was their explorer by the name of John Cabot. And John Cabot did something very important for them. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about Cabot. Cabot was Italian. He wasn't English. It's kind of the common thing we have here. Usually it seems like the explorer sails for a different country than where he's actually from. But Cabot was actually a contemporary of Columbus, was from the same town of Genoa as Columbus, and may very well have known Columbus when they were young. But what we know about John Cabot was that in the 1490s, actually, he sailed over here. The reason why he actually got the job in the first place was because in the year 1491, a year before Columbus went west, Cabot was known as the man who had gone further west into the Atlantic Ocean than anyone else. Now, the reason why he went so far west was not because he believed there was a continent out there. He was looking for the lost island of Lagre. And Lagre was this mysterious island. You might have heard of it. It's called sometimes Avalon. If you ever read the story of King Arthur, you might recall that King Arthur is taken to the island of Avalon, which is kind of like a heaven. And Lagre was rumored to be out there in the middle of the Atlantic. It's also sometimes seen as Atlantis. And Cabot, if it was out there, wanted to find this. He was that kind of man. He was curious. He wanted to know, okay, if it's out there, let's see if we can find it. Well, this brought him to the attention of the English king. And as a result, Cabot was hired and he was sent out to claim lands for England. And he actually, as far as we can tell, was the first European in this time to actually find North America. And he laid claim to most of North America, especially the East Coast as we know it today, for the English. And then the next great thing that Cabot does is he disappears. It's one of those kind of strange things in history. We don't know what he did afterwards for the most part. We can trace the steps for a little while, but then he just vanishes. But all the same, what Cabot did was he gave the English a legal right to lay claim to all those lands. But what's strange is the English laid a claim to it. They had this legal saying that it was theirs, but then they did nothing with it for decades, actually for almost a century. Now, the next explorer, who was more than just an explorer that we'll talk about, was Sir Francis Drake. And Sir Francis Drake was an English captain. He really was a warrior. He really was someone who understood the whole art of naval warfare very well. He was the first Englishman to actually sail all the way around the world. He did it several decades after Magellan, but he was the first Englishman to do so. He also was a man who subscribed to the idea of the Reformation. He was said to always keep two books with him. He had the Bible, and he had Fox's Book of Martyrs, which tells the stories of various people who believed in the doctrines of the Reformation and were actually tortured or put to death for their beliefs. And Drake was actually consistent. He actually was a man who would regularly preach to his sailors. He was also a man who would try to convert prisoners when he captured them. But Drake, like you and I, was also inconsistent. Drake really earned his living because he was a pirate. He was given one of those certificates that allowed him to go and attack Spanish ships and basically take whatever wealthy cargo they had on board. Not only that, but Drake was one of the first people, or first Englishmen that is, to deal in African slaves. And so Drake has a disconnect here. He really is not a great reformational character because he does love the Bible, he does understand its doctrines in some ways, but he doesn't apply them to something simple like whether or not slavery is morally or biblically correct. And so Drake is interesting in that way. But the reason why we're talking about Drake is not necessarily because of what he believed, but because Drake made it possible for the English to dominate the seas. You see, in the year 1588, the Spanish launched the largest fleet that had been seen in anyone's memory. It was a huge fleet of ships. It's known today as the Spanish Armada. And the plan was simple: sail up to the English Channel, destroy whatever English ships are there, and then land a massive army coming over from the continent onto English soil, take over the throne from Queen Elizabeth, and make England a Catholic country under the reign of the Habsburg family, which ruled most of Europe at that time. There was just one problem. The Spanish Armada wasn't counting on the fact that A, there would be a storm that would wreck most of their fleet, and B, Sir Francis Drake, with his smaller ships that were more easy to maneuver, was able to outgun them and outmaneuver them and sink most of their fleet. The Spanish Armada was almost entirely lost. Of the few surviving bits that remained, some of the sailors made it on board or on shore of the land of England. Most of them were attacked by villagers who were quite angry that they tried to attack their country in the first place. Out of the ships, only a few returned, most of them washed up as driftwood throughout the shores of Europe, including places like England, where they were turned into nice furniture. That's how the English treated the Spanish Armada. Now, the other person we'll talk about today is someone you may never have heard of. His name was Richard Hakluyt. And Richard Hakluyt was a man who, very early on in his life, had incredible vision. Like Drake and like Cabot, he was a man that was used to ships. He was a man who knew quite a bit about navigation. But he was a man that stood out because he had an incredible vision. And this vision for ultimately founding a reformational colony in the New World, a colony that would extend the gospel as he called it, he says that this vision for doing such a hard task came one day when he saw a Bible and a map next to each other. And the Bible was open. In fact, it was open to the book of Psalms. And there in Psalm 107, verses 23 to 24, he read this: "They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep." In other words, when he looked at this verse, he realized that there's a blessing to actually going out in ships and doing this work, particularly the work that God has done for you, or the work that God has set out for you to do. And so what Hakluyt did was Hakluyt enlisted his friend, a man by the name of Sir Walter Raleigh, who's become known as the Shepherd of the Ocean. Together, they convinced Queen Elizabeth to allow them to found a colony in the New World, particularly in the region that would someday be called Virginia. They sailed over there. They found a suitable place in what was probably the Outer Banks of Virginia. And then they returned home. Raleigh outfitted a huge expedition that included over 600 men. And they were designed to transport English civilization, because there were soldiers, of course, to provide security, but then there were people like craftsmen, carpenters, masons, there were engineers, there was a surveyor, there was a painter, there was a naturalist, there was a chemist, there was a surgeon. In other words, they were trying to transport all of English civilization, except for one crucial part. They didn't have any farmers. They didn't have anyone who had a great deal of knowledge about soil and about reproducing food. Now, Raleigh promised to return to the colony. He didn't stay there with him. He went back to England, and the colony was founded in 1587, which was 1 year before the attack of the Spanish Armada. Raleigh was supposed to return in 1588, but the Spanish Armada attacked, and then that caused all kinds of other problems, so he didn't actually return to the colony of Roanoke, as it was called, until 1590. When he got back there, there's a great mystery that he found, and that was the place where Roanoke was essentially not like he left it. There was no one around. There was no evidence, there was no bodies of anyone who had been killed or who had died. There was simply no one there. All he found were a few overgrown huts, several overturned chests, and a mysterious word, Croatoan, in the middle of one of these trees on this lost colony of Roanoke. In other words, this colony was a massive failure. This colony was something that almost cost Raleigh his head when he returned back to England and gave the report that it was just gone. As a result, the English, who were already almost 100 years too late, had their first colony completely fail. But of course, the story of the English and the story of the Reformation through the English in the New World isn't over. We'll pick up that story tomorrow.